Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me for this video. I put this epic forest together using a lot of products by DioramaPresepe.com. As you can see, these scenics are incredibly realistic, and I'd like to think this is the best forest scene I've made yet. It's true to say that these products make scenery making a lot easier, but they also produce masterful results. If your intention is to make your scenery look as realistic as possible, well, you're in the right place. So if you've grabbed yourself a cup of tea or coffee, sit back, relax, and let's begin. Most of the trees are made using very thin florist wire. I cut each piece to about 30 centimeters, only because that's about the width of this board. And then when I'd got a fairly substantial bunch, it doesn't really matter how many you use, depends on the thickness of your tree, I just started twisting them up, and then I folded them in two to make two trunks. And trimming the ends here to an equal length just makes twisting the branches that bit easier later. Now the basic process for making a wire tree is you just keep dividing each section in two. And each time you divide a section, you twist them round each other to make a branch. Eventually you'll end up with just 2 or 3 wires at the end, and that should give you a nice spread of branches. Now what I also did here was looped some wires back on themselves and twisted them round, and then cut that loop open to make yet further branches. And when you've got all your branches done, you can pose the tree as you like. If you want some roots, you can cut the bottom loop of the trunks open and repeat the same steps you took with the branches, but I didn't bother here because the bottom of my tree was going to be buried anyway. Further trees were made using 7-inch lengths of slightly thicker florist's wire. These were made using the same fundamental technique as for the thinner wire trees, but I left them as single trunk trees and included some roots. I also used this wire to make some thicker trunks. And because this wire is quite tough to manipulate, I decided to combine 2 thick trunks to make an extra large tree. This just involved wrapping a piece of wire around the 2 trunks, just making sure to maintain the shape the 2 trunks made together. To help the texturing compound adhere to the trunks, I used some water-based primer sent to me by Plasticoat. Now this primer is actually foam safe, and for that reason you'll see me later on using it on the foam base as well. To texture these trees I used instant papier mache. Well, I say instant, but it does actually need mixing and then leaving in an airtight bag for an hour or so. It's basically a very fine cellulose powder which you mix with water, and you'd think it would go off like sculpt mould, or at least I did, but it doesn't. You really do have to follow the instructions on the packet carefully, otherwise it just doesn't dry. But if you do that, then you can apply it with a brush or your finger or both, and you end up with a very nice bark-like texture. You'll probably need to work it into all the gaps, just pressing it in carefully. I used a brush more than my finger. And then I left them to dry in a very dry shed during the heat wave we had a few weeks back, and by the next day they'd set up completely. But getting that texture to cover the tip of every branch proved impossible, so I fell back on my tried and tested method of using some CFS latex with some CFS resin filler. There's no exact science here, I just got an old yogurt pot, filled it with latex, and then scooped in resin filler until I achieved a fairly thick mix. And by thick I mean about the consistency of the yogurt that would have been in the pot to begin with. I just kept adding the filler until I got the mix right. In fact, you can use this mixture to coat your trees before you even apply any texture. You don't even have to apply texture if you apply this mixture. It really depends what you're after. If you want a tree that remains completely flexible, use this mixture without any texture on it, and it'll fill in the gaps between your wires very nicely. But if you're after a more realistic tree and aren't worried about flexibility, follow the method I'm employing here. Just bear in mind that if you do want a flexible tree, the more filler you add, the more likely it is for the mixture to tear once it's dry. For the base of this diorama, I used a sheet of extruded polystyrene. And because this piece was made during lockdown and sculpt mould couldn't be bought for love nor money, I decided to have a go at making my own with mixed results. This is basically toilet paper taken off the roll and soaked in water, then mashed up and whisked up and dried in an oven, and mixed 50-50 with plaster of Paris. The problem I found was that it dried much faster than sculpt mould and it didn't have the same feel, and when it did dry it felt a lot more brittle than sculpt mould. I don't know what Amaco puts in their mix, but it's wonderful stuff and mine isn't so good. But in a pinch, it'll do. And I used this homemade sculpt mould to set my trees onto the base, building up the landscape around the tree roots and just holding the tree in place until the sculpt mould, in inverted commas, was dry enough to support the tree. I also used the same compound to model rocks over the surface of the base, and now there's not too much that's going to need to be said for a while, so I'm just going to let the video do the talking for a bit, but don't worry, I'm still here. Okay, now for some smaller rocks I used milliput, and I would highly recommend wearing gloves as a safety precaution. There are those with epoxy allergies. I'm not one of them, so I'm not using gloves here, but you can still develop epoxy allergies, so it's a case of do as I say and not do as I do. And you can see here I'm using the Plasticoat primer again, and I can confirm that it didn't eat into the foam. The undercoat for the earth texture I'd be using later was just a mixture of brown acrylic paints. And here's the first of many Diorama Presepe products I used. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Italian words, I'd just make a fool of myself, but this is a very nice earth texture. And I just applied it directly over the wet paint. It turned out the wet paint wasn't enough to hold it, so I used my own brand Scenic Glue, and I also used my own brand Black Diorama Wash. You can get samples of these in some of the kits I sell on my website at hiiworkshop.co.uk. And this black wash also gets applied over the tree trunks, and this is pretty much the only paint job they need apart from a little bit of lichen later on. And because I applied the Plasticoat primer to all the branches, the wash adheres really nicely. But to touch up any areas that I just couldn't get the wash to stick to, I used a little bit of black spray paint. I've been incredibly lucky to have been supported by Diorama Presepe, and I can honestly say they're the best products I've ever used. But of course I still use other products such as Woodland Scenics turf. I only ended up using the green blend fine turf actually, which I applied over a layer of hobby and craft glue from Plasticoat, which again they were very generous in sending me. And because this is a mossy forest, I also applied some over the trees. A good technique is to apply the spray glue and then blow the fine turf off your hand. And this all gets sealed with Plasticoat matte sealer. The moss highlights were made using WWS static grass. This is their 1mm dead variety. And then it was on to the really fun part, applying all the Diorama Presepe vegetation. I'm just going to let the video do the talking here, except to say that I applied most of this using Mod Podge matte. Oh, and a bit of my own Scenic Glue. So get comfortable and watch how these stunning products bring this forest to life. I generally use a toothpick to apply this Vallejo paint. In this case I found that I could simply scrape it over the surface of parts of the trunks, whereas before I've used a more pointillist kind of technique. To lend the forest a more overgrown kind of look, I used some Diorama Presepe vines and stuck these on with super glue and then an accelerator so that the super glue gel would go off almost instantly. For the foliage I decided on Diorama Presepe Taloxis Bloom. This I think is sea foam stabilised before it dries out, and honestly it makes for the most wonderfully realistic foliage. But to allow light through for the photography, I decided to apply the foliage sparingly. And I was done. I hope you liked this project and this video. Please do check out dioramapresepe.com. And if you want to support these videos and get some extra goodies to boot, you might want to become a patron. Head over to patreon.com/HEW where you can access rewards such as early viewing of these videos, access to the Patreon only Facebook supporters group, and voting on the topic of future videos. Patreon supporters also get a discount on the diorama kits I sell through my website. Head over to highworkshop.co.uk to visit my online store, where I have various scenery making sets for sale, including deluxe diorama kits, which have proved incredibly popular, and I'm very grateful to everyone who has supported me by buying a kit. Each kit contains everything you need to build a specific 10cm by 10cm scene, and each design is limited edition, never to be repeated. I add new kits periodically, and will always announce the release of a new kit through my Instagram channel, on Facebook, and through the community feed here on YouTube. I'd like to thank Diorama Presepe for supporting me with so many products, and also Plasticoat, who have been very generous too. A huge thank you to my patrons, and lastly, please like and subscribe. Cheers!